When you're dealing with the keyword this, you want to be careful about using arrow functions. There are certain places that you shouldn't use arrow functions because of how they determine the object referenced by the keyword this. Let's first look at an example to see the problem, and then we will go through a list of places where you should avoid using arrow functions. All right, here I have a simple object created with an object literal. I have a first name property, last name property, and then I have a full name method that is set up. And this is using a traditional function right now. And so let's go ahead and log to the console whatever is returned from this method, obj.fullname. We'll just log that to the console. We know how this is going to turn out for us because we know that this particular application works. We get the first and last name showing up. Now, what would happen if we change this to an arrow function? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to just create it down here, and then I'll comment out the other one. So full name, here's how to go about using an arrow function for a method. Although this is something you should avoid. This is the first thing we're talking about that you should avoid, is using an arrow function for a method. I don't need the curly braces. I don't know why I put them there. And then I'm just going to copy this string literal here and put it in. Okay, let's go ahead and comment out this. And we'll save that and see what we get. We get undefined, undefined. Now, I hope you are able to describe why that happens now with an arrow function. With a regular function, the object that the method is called from determines the object referenced by the keyword this. That's not the case with an arrow function. The arrow function uses the value of this for the current context, and that would be window, because window is the current object pointed to by the keyword this that is set up by the execution context. So that is what this becomes for an arrow function. It's not changed by the object that is invoked. And therefore, using this as a part of that doesn't refer back to the object. And so it doesn't work for us. It's looking for first name or last name, first name and last name on the window object, which it isn't there. So using an arrow function to define a method on an object is obviously not a good idea. This is the first place not to use an arrow function, the first one we're talking about. And the second is very much like it. Let's go ahead and look at that list. So the first is defining an object method. We don't want to use an arrow function there. And I said the second is very much like it, and that's for the prototype, a prototype object. We haven't covered prototypes yet, but basically the prototype method would be borrowed by another object or inherited by that object, whichever term you prefer to talk about when referring to prototypes. So because that method would be used by an object, just like we saw with the object method, you're going to have the same problem. It's not a different situation. It's exactly the same situation. All right, third area where we should not use arrow function, and that's a function with dynamic context. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, the best way to explain that is with an example. And we're going to use this page again. And let me open up that code. Now, as we know, the keyword this in JavaScript is a pretty powerful feature. As we've learned, it allows changing the context depending on the way the function is called. So if a function is dependent upon the object, then we're going to run into the same problem. And this usually happens when we're using an event listener with a callback. So let's go ahead and set that up. I'm going to use the same div right here and add an event listener to that. So first I want to grab that div. We'll use document.getElementById again. I still have the ID of title2 in there, so we'll be able to grab that just fine. Now I want to add an event listener. And we'll use the click event again. And this time I'm going to use just a regular function. And then we'll see what happens with an arrow function. So here's my regular function. And then notice what I'm doing here with my code. This.inner HTML. So this is going to refer to the div. And so the inner HTML of that div, what am I going to do with it? Well, I'm going to change it. I'm going to change it like this, set it equal to I was clicked. Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and save that. And I'm going to jump out here. When I click on that, notice that it changes. The text changes. And we're able to do that with the keyword this. And if we attach this event listener to some other DOM element, it'd work on that DOM element as well. But if we use an arrow function here, like that, you can probably guess we're not going to get the same results. Once again, because it's an arrow function, the value of this is taken from the context. And so it's going to be window. And so that's not going to work for us. So that is the third area we do not want to use arrow functions. The final area is as part of a constructor. And we haven't dealt with constructors in this course either, but a constructor is a way to create objects. And usually when you're setting up a constructor, you'll use the keyword this to refer to the object that is being created. Well, you can imagine what would happen if we used arrow functions in the case of that. The object would become something like window instead of the object that's being created. And so that's another area we do not want to use arrow functions. So those four areas are ones to remember. Now, before we finish this topic, just one initial note I want to mention in regards to not using arrow functions. It really has nothing to do with the keyword this, but I still want to mention it. Now, the short syntax on arrow function is great, but sometimes using multiple arrow functions together in your code can make it difficult to reason about. If there's an arrow function, an arrow function, an arrow function, something like that, it might be nice and short, but it may not be worth it because it's hard to read. It's hard and difficult to reason about, and so it may be another place that you want to avoid arrow functions. All right, enough about when not to use arrow functions. Let's go ahead and move on.